Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. This is the program, What Do You Think? My name is Bill Morse, and I welcome you every Thursday from quarter to 6 to 6:30. And this is a call-in program whereby I bring up a theme and you call and give some response or some feedback, or on your own initiative, you call in with a theme or a question, and myself and others that may want to call in will give feedback. So tonight we're going to be tying up a loose end. I've mentioned over the last probably 7 to 8 weeks almost that I've been in touch with the Senator Patrick Leahy's Washington office, his communications person, David, and I thought later on this evening we would go through basically how a bill becomes law and give the senators attempt to make steer a bipartisan immigration bill in 2013 to the president's table for a signature, which has not happened yet. And when we go through the process of how a bill becomes law in our country, then it'll become apparent there are numerous pitfalls. So I just want to first give my 3 recommendations for YouTube channels. The first one is a fellow that I've been following for maybe 7 or 8 months. His name is Big Herc, H-E-R-C, as in Hercules. You can find him on YouTube. His channel is Big Herc, H-E-R-C 916. But if you forget the number, just try to remember Big Herc. He's a big guy. Interesting perspective on life. Military son. Got into trouble, spent time in prison, and has a unique perspective on life, one that is very uplifting. And he actually has a counseling service for younger people, mostly boys that need guidance that they have not been receiving at home. So he gives these uplifting talks, maybe anywhere from 4 minutes to 10 minutes on YouTube, and they're generally in front of his, I think it's a green Javelin. He's a bit of a car collector and recently moved from California to Arizona. So Big Herc 916 I recommend. And another fellow that I've mentioned also on this program is Barricade Garage. Another person involved in cars. He's a car mechanic, works mostly on Jeeps. And he too had spent some time in trouble with gangs and was incarcerated, put in solitary confinement in a federal penitentiary for a time, and then came out, and really started a new life, having his own business repairing cars. And he used to do skits in which he would play different personalities, but now it's mostly live streaming. And his topics, some of it is self-help. He says what he thinks in no uncertain terms. It's very blunt. But I believe he speaks from a genuine perspective, good heart, and he's got a lot of good advice, especially for people that don't know quite where they're going and have not quite worked out their own personal value system. So Barricade Garage is a second recommendation. And then more on both Herc and Barricade Garage are spiritual. But this is more religious. Father Mark Goring, Goring. He's a Catholic priest. And I would recommend listening to some of his brief talks, like 5-10 minutes. And then his homilies are posted on his YouTube channel. He's the parish priest of a church outside of Toronto. So Father Mark Goring, Goring. Okay, two stories I wanted to share that came to my attention recently. Both of them are uplifting. The first story takes place in 1965. It's February, it's rainy, and you're on the side of a highway in Alabama. You're an older woman, you're traveling, your car is broken down, and you've got somewhere to go urgently. You try to flag somebody down. Remember, this is Alabama. You get some torrential downpours. It's just, it'll flatten you. Somebody does stop. A gentleman does stop. And he pushes the car off the side of the road so it's not hit by other traffic. And he takes the woman into town and sets her off into a taxi. Well, 7 days later, he receives a surprise delivery on his front porch. It's a color TV. Now, a color television in 1965 is a big deal. In 1965, as I'm sure our two listeners will remember, the majority of the programming was still in black and white. And NBC Peacock appeared. This program brought to you in living color. It was a big deal in 1965. Anyway, there was a note attached. The woman had gotten the man's mailing address before she left in the taxi. And in the note, she says, "I want to thank you once again for what you did for me. I was at a very low point in my life. My husband was dying, and I could not get to him. I was afraid I would miss him in his dying moments. Fortunately, because you stopped and helped me out, I was able to reach the hospital in time to visit with my husband before he passed away. God bless you." And the note was signed Mrs. Nat King Cole. So it's, I thought that was a beautiful story. The man didn't know who she was. The man was of another race, and 1965, that still mattered in certain places. Unfortunately, we're still seeing it matter in much of the U.S., but they were of a different race, and they still helped each other out. So I thought that was a good story. Nat King Cole, for those of you who may not know who he was a great singer. He was a black singer. People talk about prejudice nowadays, but I think, and this isn't talked about enough, we've made a lot of progress. Just in laws, not only in laws, but in people's hearts. And I don't think that gets spoken enough. The positive gets spoken enough, often enough. I think, and perhaps Fred and Kurt may know about this, he tried to, one of the networks gave him a singing show. He's a very good singer. And he could not get any sponsors because of his skin color. This was in the 50s. Finally, the network, and I can't tell you who to give credit to, whether it was ABC, NBC, or CBS, the network agreed to run the Nat King Cole show. I think this was in 56 or 57, for about half of a season, to get it up and running, to give Nat King Cole exposure to the American TV audience, and thereby attract and build a following, have established good ratings for the advertisers that hopefully would be interested in advertising on Mr. King's show. Unfortunately, that did not happen. No major advertiser stepped forward and signed a contract to sponsor Nat King Cole's program. So after half a season, his program ended. That is a shame, because as far as music is concerned, he was and still is a national treasure. So anyway, interesting story about his wife in the last evening of his life. Again, this was February of 1965. Second story takes place in a hotel restaurant. Again, we're roughly the late 60s. And a little boy comes in to the restaurant and he sits down by himself. The waitress comes over, puts down a glass of water and says, "What would you like?" And the little boy asks, "How much is an ice cream sundae?" Waitress responds, 50 cents. So he takes out his coins from his pocket, he counts it, and he looks up at the waitress and he says, "How much does a plain dish of ice cream cost?" And she says, kind of abruptly, because there are people waiting to be seated and she's the only waitress in that section of the restaurant. She says abruptly, 35 cents, and she's impatient. So he says, "I'll take a dish of chocolate ice cream." So he has the chocolate ice cream. He leaves. The waitress comes over, same waitress comes over to clean the table, and what do you think she finds next to the bill? She finds two nickels and 5 pennies under the dish as a tip. So in other words, I thought this was very interesting. It shows the boy had a lot of good support at home to know this. The boy had, instead of buying the sundae for 50 cents and leaving the waitress no tip, the boy downgraded, let's say, and picked up the 35-cent dish of ice cream and left the 2 nickels and the 5 pennies as a tip. So I thought that was pretty cool. Those are the 2 uplifting stories under the category of how to treat people. So we have 2 callers. Callers, do you have any comment on those 2 questions? Those 2 stories before I move on to Senator Leahy?
Well, just really hope that good stories become contagious.
I think the nature of the story, the people who are involved, and just the commonness of the interaction and of the demonstration of goodwill and respect for the other people. I mean, how often do you go out to a restaurant and you tip somebody? Very common. But if you're a little boy with a limited budget and you're alone, it can be rather intimidating. So kudos to the boy for doing the right thing. As I said, he had good family support. That's not something you are born with, is knowledge. But
agreed.
Yeah, agreed. Any other comments on either of the 2 short stories?
Well, it's unfortunate that when you listen to network television, it's so focused on negativity. It's just unfortunate that you don't hear little stories like that, perhaps even at the end of the broadcast, maybe to leave somebody with a positive note, costs nothing, but it doesn't seem the major networks are focused on doing that.
I think, Kurt, you're right. That was the reason why Andy Rooney was kept until the end of 60 Minutes. And I think he was the leitmotif, or he was whatever the subject. And sometimes there were 3 or 4 subjects on 60 Minutes, and there was generally 1 upbeat story and 2 downers about things that were really messed up. And not only messed up, but it's frustrating when someone is presented a story of something messed up in their country and they can't really do anything about it. They don't feel they have the power or they can do anything to change that situation. But Andy Rooney, I think, was kind of a partial attempt at an anecdote to that despair that is engendered and that is fed by the negativity that you just alluded to. And I'm I'm sad. I'm glad that he was there, part of the picture for a while. But I talking right now, I kind of miss him.
Me as well.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, Andy Rooney could tell you all those things he didn't like, but it was a positive.
Yes, and they
He
got
had a way
you.
of doing it.
They got you to laugh. In a way, he reminded me. He reminds me of. Oh, come on, Seinfeld. Seinfeld's comedy, stand-up comedy was. Do you ever have this happen to you? Kind of reminds me of Andy Rooney, who says, "Do you ever try to open a medicine bottle or something like that? Something that's frustrating." Or one time he was trying to navigate through a phone tree on a rotary phone. It was funny. Dial phone. So it's funny. It's funny because what he tells you, you can relate to. What he's sharing is very easy to relate with, and he laughs and gets you to laugh at your own at your own experience. So, all right, cool. Anything else? Say two. Okay, great.
Me too.
Say two. All right. So, as you both know, about 2 months ago, I got in touch. I called the Washington office for our Senator Patrick Leahy. I'm not familiar with Patrick Leahy since he's been senator of Vermont since the late 70s, and I've spent most of my time, adult time, out of Vermont, so I wasn't up on what he was doing. But a couple of things intrigued me. One was the fact that he was still in office. I believe he's 80. He turned 80 a month ago. And, whether you like them or not, people in political office or support them or you're skeptical, they put in a lot of time traveling, sit time, as both of you know, sitting through meetings and during which they probably wish they were somewhere else. But sit time takes a toll on your body and your mind. Just sitting there and listening, hoping for something that can be useful in your own purposes. And so I thought, let me come up with some questions from myself and other people and see what feedback I get from the senator's office. So I spoke with David. David has been with Senator Leahy for 25 years. He's a journalist. He told me he was a by-the-book journalist, which I suppose he said to distinguish himself from many of the people that in today's media are journalists, but don't really do much digging, and they lack the finesse and they lack the tenacity and also the background knowledge that earlier journalists in our country had. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he told me that, and this was interesting, he regretted a couple of things that were happening in the country, some trends. One of them was the trend away from civics in school, where students are not learning about how government works. They're not learning how democracy works. They're not learning about geography, even in their own country. And so that struck a chord of resonance with me. I also think that history and geography have been ill-served under the mantle of social studies. Social studies, in my opinion, can be easily manipulated to the point where you are teaching a narrative, a political narrative, or an ideology, and you're getting away from what happened at this date, at this time, this date in this place, and why did it happen, and how is it connected to a chain of events, and how do we work as a government to alter this chain of events or to improve the average person's life or standard of living or opportunities, freedoms, protections. So that's why I sent him these questions. And I think, and Kurt, you'll relate to this because we talked about this, one of the most important questions that keeps coming up is, why is government so so stuck in traffic? Why is there a log jam in the legislative path when a bill is introduced and eventually, hopefully, through the sponsors, becomes law or doesn't become law? Why is that such a difficult and time-consuming process? And why do so many good bills just die for lack of interest, for lack of the right support? And so I thought I'd like to find out a little bit more about this, especially when you hear on the news some of these bills that many people in the bills in their final form who are voting on them have not read, because the bills are thousands of pages long and they've gone through so many committee hands and have been altered by so many different people in the process that it becomes this bloated entity of details in which sometimes the main objective is lost. If you recall, and this sticks in my mind, and this has been brought up to me before, the Economic Recovery Act, in which there was a stimulus payment for $600 for each working American. Tied into that were money for projects both in this country but surprisingly overseas. And so people that were critical of this relief bill that became law pointed at certain things like, why are we giving money to Pakistan for gender studies? That's a big one. I think 15 million went to Pakistan for gender studies. And what happens is you get 3 or 4 of those details coming out of the bill, and it sours a lot of people. First off, the need is there. Since businesses are shut down, many people have lost their jobs, and the states needed financial help in supporting their unemployment compensation programs. So we had this impact for a year now. Finally, I think we're out of the tunnel to the point where the finances are going to start coming back to normal. It was just a hell of a train wreck in which everything was stopped when it hit the wall, and one thing was, everything is so interconnected, and it doesn't really come to light until you hit that brick wall and you realize that jobs are lost, rents aren't paid, heating bills aren't paid, landlords aren't paid, people are out of work because non-essential services have been curtailed or just realigned to be online services or remote services. And then you get the emotional cost of all this alienation, and of course schools. I'm not even speaking about children with special needs that were pretty much, I'm not going to say ignored because that's not true, but let's just say that it was, I think they bore the brunt of this disruption. And finally, I think in most states, New York City's, which I kind of use as a barometer for the extreme, is actually going back to in-person instruction in September. But it was a litmus. It was kind of a litmus test in that people's motivations came through, and so it's. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people. It was a wake-up call for me. I didn't realize how deep certain things ran. So I'm just going to go over quickly, and you guys probably know most of this. Again, I don't think this is taught in school. In fact, I would probably bet you it's not taught in school. But what happens? How does a bill become law? Well, I looked at 3 or 4 sources online so that I got pretty much a balanced, non-biased rundown on the step. They're pretty straightforward. And the first one is you come up with an idea. You're a senator or you're a congressperson. You come up with an idea for something you want done. And it could be almost anything. Money for appropriation for this. I'm not going to say regulation because that's a word that comes up later. But you want something done. You have an idea. Your staff, hopefully you have a staff that has the legal knowledge of how to write this bill so that it is not immediately thrown back and rejected, but it has the right language, the right English language to be a bill for consideration. Once that bill is written, then it's sponsored by that lawyer, although they are many lawyers, by that congressperson or that senator. Then it goes into a subcommittee, or it goes into a full committee. Most of these bills go into subcommittees, which are smaller groups within a full committee. And depending on what public services is touched by the intent of this bill, you have people coming from that public service, or organizations, both municipal, governmental, or private, and they weigh in on this bill, the idea, the intent of this bill, and they give feedback. And they give testimony, they either written or verbal, in person. Studies are conducted. So you can see where it takes months. A bill can stay months in a subcommittee, and then it goes before the full committee, which is the subcommittee and the rest of everybody else, the legislators that are on that committee. And there are more testimonies, there are more studies, and there's more debate back and forth. Now, most bills die at that stage. They do not see the light of leaving the committee room and going before the full body of the Congress or the Senate. If it does go through, then it is voted on. It is introduced in Congress. It would be introduced by the Speaker of the House, currently Nancy Pelosi, and Nancy Pelosi would, in Congress this happens, she has control of the calendar. If she liked your bill, then she would give it a timely spot where it would be discussed in at a time when there will be like 2 weeks of Congress, and they're not going to adjourn. This is important. You need to have at least 2 weeks, so that because you're not done with potential pitfalls here. So, or she can say, I'll schedule it for next year. And that's if she didn't like it. So it would never be discussed. Or it could, I'm not going to say that. It could never come to a vote. So if the situation is different in the Senate, there's less chance of the scheduling being used as a weapon, and it's just scheduled in sequence. So there's less personal intervention in the scheduling of a bill for a vote, for a discussion, further discussion, and a later vote in the Senate, and more chance of a personal intervention, let's say, for scheduling in Congress. So anyway, the bill comes out of committee, and you're about 2/3 of the way through the process. The remaining third is that bill gets discussed again before the whole body of Congress, or before the whole House and Senate. And there's debates, there's amendments that get voted on, and boom, if it gets approved by a majority vote, then the Senate has its bill that is ready to be voted by both houses as law. Now, generally, these bills have parallel. They have a brother and a sister. The brother is in the Senate, and somebody with a similar bill is in Congress. And sometimes through the subcommittee discussions and changes, you have a similar bill that when it comes out of committee and comes through the chamber vote, Senate for one bill, and Congress for its sister bill, for lack of a better word. The two bills are different because you have different politicians, different lawmakers that have had a chance to work that bill and massage it a little bit and put in their own wants in exchange. You have the horse dealing. So in that case, when you have two bills with the same intent, but both bills are very different in how they get to that intent, then you have a conference committee that takes the two bills and tries to work out a compromise bill from the two. And that one that they're sure will get approved by both the House of Congress and the Senate. And, all right, we're approaching like the home stretch here. If both bodies approve the reconfigured bill, and they need to do that by a majority. In the Senate, that would be, nowadays, that's considered 60 votes. We have 2 senators per state. We have 50 states. At least we did this evening. 50 states. So that's 100 senators. And generally, you would say 51, but generally it works out to 60. 60 seems to be the benchmark of what they look for in passing and being confident that a bill will become law. So the bill becomes law with a majority vote in both houses, and it goes before the president. The president has 10 days to act. Now, this is where the timing is important. If within the 10 days Congress goes in recesses, the president can just take that bill, put it in his pocket, and forget about it, and the bill does not become law. They call that a pocket veto. Have either of you heard of a pocket veto, Fred or Kurt?
I have not.
Fred?
Yeah, no, I learned that in civics, but I don't think I get the full, measure of how it really works.
Okay, did that help?
So I believe it does, but I think when a president vetoes, he can be, or she someday will be overridden. So are you saying the pocket veto doesn't subject itself to an override vote?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Si, senor. It does. It does open itself up, because that's the next recourse that both houses would have, is they would have to override that pocket veto, all right, with a 2/3 majority. So 2/3 would be like 66 in the Senate, and I don't know how many 2/3 would be in Congress. I believe we have 435 Congress members, So it would be 2/3 of that. So we're talking 300 some odd congressmen or congresswomen would have to vote in favor of the bill for it to become law through an override of that presidential veto. But pocket veto or otherwise, it's still a veto. So that can be overridden with 2/3 vote.
And Bill, if I could ask you, because my guess is you may not know, I certainly don't.
Try me. Maybe if I don't know, I'll make something up.
If the president decides to pocket the bill as a pocket veto, I would think that the president might do that if the putting it in the pocket will end up running up against Congress not being in session. And then it would require whoever's the Speaker of the House to require the politicians to come back in and vote it or not.
Yes, I believe that has happened a number of times. I think I can't name a specific instance. My mind is drawing a blank, but that does happen on a fairly regular basis where Congress is in recess and they are called back because of this similar situation. Where there is strong bipartisan support for something, but the president does not support the intent of the bill. So, yes, to your question. Okay? Now, an interesting thing is that once this bill, let's say you're president, and you want to play along. Let's say the bill has bipartisan support from both the Democrats and the Republicans. You want to play along, and you don't veto, but you sign the bill. And you sign the bill. You have the option later on of having an impact as president as to the regulations that are created once this bill becomes law. In other words, let's say there's a law regarding some form of environmental protection. And so that law comes to the EPA. Well, you as president have a voice in how regulations are fashioned to interpret. It's a big word, interpret that law. Now, if you interpret that law a certain way, your regulations are going to reflect the details, the gritty details as to how that law is implemented and by the agency or agencies. Because many times, as you know, these the impact of these laws goes across boundaries, and that's what makes them very tricky to create first as bills and to grow them into laws with the necessary approval. So the executive arm, that is the president, can kind of twist the legislature's law, the legislator's law, to either negate the intent or to strengthen the intent. So it's interesting. I didn't realize the regulations were that important, but thinking now, those regulations either make the law workable or they don't. They either strengthen the law or they neuter it, or the law isn't enforced and by the president. So it's that's another way of getting at this. Now, we went through this kind of long process of how a bill becomes a law and how the law can even be changed through regulations from the president's desk. Because in 2013, Senator Leahy tried to push through or steer through a immigration reform bill. Now, to give you a little background, the last time there was immigration reform in the United States was 1986. And that was only after 15 years of effort. 15 years of effort at doing something concrete with how we handle immigration in the United States. 1986, nothing had changed since then. 2013, Patrick Leahy, a senator from Vermont, is pushing through this bill that basically gives a pathway to citizenship through different phases. First phase, obviously, is we check you out to make sure you're not wanted, you're not a criminal, you're not going to be a burden on our social system. And then secondly, there's another one where employment is verified. There was a computer check that employers could go into to see if so-and-so was an illegal alien or a proper documented worker through a visa program. Also, through Republican intervention and working with the Democrats, because this bill was bipartisan, there was money for a fence, and there was money for increasing the Border Patrol. And I find it ironic because that was in 2013, and in less than 10 years we're squabbling still over a fence, which there was bipartisan support for at one time, and over increasing border security. So, to me, as a neophyte, as a novice just looking at this for the first time, and also there was a different path of immigration for children. You had one for adults and one for children, which is logical, practical. It seemed like something for both camps. There were opportunities, and yet at the same time the law would be enforced, and there would be resources for enforcing the law, and there would be a constructive, positive plan for people who were here already to become a citizen and to legalize their status here in the U.S. It didn't go through, even though there was bipartisan support. There was not enough bipartisan support. And so there was I believe it was filibustered. Filibuster is just when one side is debating and they continue to debate, putting off a vote, continually to put off a vote. And it's a stalling tactic. And you need 60 votes in the Senate, which is where a filibuster would take place. You need 60 votes to stop the filibuster, stop the debate, and call a vote. I believe that did not happen. I'll do a little more research, but if you're interested, you can check that out yourself. So I think that was in the last 20 years, he spent a lot of time building up bipartisan support for an immigration plan that both sides of the House, Democrat and Republican, could sign. I'd love to get more direct feedback from him. I'm going to pursue this with David at his office and fill you in on this next week. It's interesting. I brushed up on how a bill became a law. I'd forgotten some of this. I was uncertain about a filibuster, how that worked, and how it could stall or derail a bill that had made it out of the committee for a discussion, and where most of the votes had been lined up. So I'll come back to the second part of the story next week. Any comments from either of you gentlemen? Oh, by the way, just as a comparison, when this bill was introduced in 2013, there were 11 million people here illegally. In 2020, last year, that number jumped to 14.5 million people who are here illegally. But anyway, we've got to wrap this up. I'm going to ask you, gentlemen, if you have any comments on this story so far. Again, I'm going to kind of do more research and find out what exactly happened. What happened on the Senate floor that this did not become law. So, Kurt or Fred, would you like to ask something or add something?
Well, if I can jump in,
Sure.
All I can say is it's truly fortunate that this kind of gridlock regarding immigration didn't occur 100 some odd years ago. I think most of the people that are watching the program wouldn't be here if it was with all this difficulty. It's just unfortunate it takes so painfully long for this stuff to get reviewed and put in a law. Fred?
Yeah, I agree with you, Kurt. And, I think, I have a photograph, two photographs actually, one of my grandfather's leave papers. He was Lithuanian, and at that time they were part of the Russian Empire, February 1914. And and I also have his graduation picture from basic training.
Cool.
I think all these young men were fodder for the Bolsheviks back then. And he went home on leave, packed his bags, and kept heading west until he got to New York.
Fred? I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Just for general knowledge, who are the Bolsheviks?
Yeah, so the Bolsheviks, well, probably we know them now as the communists. It was a revolution to overthrow really, I think, a dysfunctional and whether it was benignly corrupt or corrupt aristocracy.
A czar.
And,
the czar.
Yeah, the czar.
Yeah.
And but the point that you were making, Kurt, is a lot of people, they come here and they come for opportunity, and immigration is, I think there's and they just didn't come for opportunity. They came to save their skins, like my grandfather too.
Absolutely.
And
Same as my grandfather.
Yeah, and that hasn't changed. And I think, to Bill, I really appreciate the civics lesson, and it, reminds me of how I think civics should be a module in every grade, every year of a child's education. And also to kind of maybe show some empathy to the immigration situation, because as Kurt said, that's kind of how we got here.
Amen.
Okay, very good, gentlemen. That ends it for the program this week. I thank you both for participating, and I encourage anyone else listening to please phone in. The Zoom information doesn't change from week to week, so keep it written down. If not, then just look for it at the bottom of the screen. But I encourage anyone watching to please call in and contribute. So, gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to find out exactly what happened to this bill, and come back with a report, because it's kind of like, where did this go? What's the end of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. So, anyway, good evening to both of you. Good evening to everyone watching, and have a good Memorial Day weekend. Please remember to fly the flag, and show support. Show support for our country that is having to prove itself right now in many ways. And we'll be back next Thursday at 5:45, 5:45 to 6:30. Thank you, and God bless. Cheers.
Thanks, Bill.